All right, your next speaker is Dr. Susan Hura. Susan's a leader in conversational UX strategy, design, and evaluation with deep experience in linguistics and speech technologies. She has built multidisciplinary teams in industry and academia and holds a doctorate in linguistics from the University of Texas at Austin. She has a proven track record of advancing UX methods and practices to deliver the value of emerging agentic and generative AI technologies. Please welcome your next speaker, Susan Hura.
Thank you, Noah. And thank you to Eric and the rest of the HFI team for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Yes, it's true. We're going to spend time talking about the dreaded chatbots that Eric mentioned in his introductory presentation this morning, as well as voice. And as you can see by my deliberately provocative title, I have some thoughts about conversation design as a profession. I've got a thesis about why I think this is true. And in order to build up my argument, I want to start with two level sets. The first thing I want to do is I would like to show you a video of a cute baby. Am I pandering to the audience? Probably. Hey, it's the middle of the afternoon. Everybody could use a cute baby video. So without further ado, let me start this. And I will ask you all that for the 30 seconds or so that it's playing, think about what this video reveals to us about conversation. Okay, here is that video. Let me see if I can make it play.
Well, what does that mean? I don't understand. Well, I think that's a really good point. But exactly what are you trying to say with the handcuff? What? What? Well, I know, but what is exactly you're trying to say? Oh, I get it. Okay. Well, that makes a lot more sense.
So I love that video. I look for excuses to play that video in all of my presentations because it's so adorable. But beyond that, I want to rattle through really quickly the set of lessons that we can take away from that 26 seconds. First of all of us are native conversationalists. We are born with the ability to converse. Conversation is an overlearned behavior in which we are fully competent before we have command of language. Conversation is also a joint action that we undertake with other humans, and it's a social action that we use to get stuff that we want, like building relationships and getting items in the world. Now, we use language as the code in these interactions, but language is not in and of itself a prerequisite for conversation. And as such, because conversation is so deeply ingrained, we also have a set of conventions about how conversations ought to run that we all know, but none of us ever think about until somebody tries to break one of these conventions. Now, notice that I am not talking about rules for conversation, or conversational maxims is another one that some of you may have heard. These are social norms we're talking about. And like any other kind of social norm, we deliberately break them when, for example, we tell jokes. Last thing that I would like you to take away from watching the video is that there is a primary setting for conversation, and it's face-to-face between two humans in real time. All right, with all of that in mind, what I want to turn to next is a brief history of some of the technologies that have been invented that have mediated human conversation. So we're going to start in 1876. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. We all know that fact. Why was the telephone so awesome? It allowed for synchronous conversation between distant participants. Now, the telephone as a medium for conversation removed access to the visual channel, but this was a downside that was far outweighed by the benefits of the technology. For about the first 100 years of the history of the telephone, when you made a phone call, you could count on a human, hopefully a human with a charming hairstyle, would pick up the phone on the other end. Okay. Not that long after that, there was a different kind of human who might answer your call. This was a switchboard operator, a human whose job it was to listen to what you wanted or who you wanted to talk to and connect you to that other human. These switchboard operators were, by the way, the very distant ancestor of today's contact center. So you pick up the phone, you talk to another human. So the telephone as a technology didn't fundamentally change how humans use conversation to get things done in the world. And of course, there's nothing yet in this world that even approaches conversation design. Where do we go from here with the tech? We are fast forwarding not that far, only to the 1890s. Did y'all know that rotary telephones were actually patented in 1892? I had no idea they were quite that old. But they really didn't come into wide use among the general public until the 1920s. This was super sticky technology. I can personally attest that I grew up and spent time in households that had rotary phones. So this is technology that lasted decades. Fast forward again, this time many more years in between, to 1961, when Bell Labs introduced touch tone phones. Like Eric, I'm an ex-Bell Labs guy, so you may hear me refer to touch tone as DTMF, dual tone multi-frequency. It's just a different way of doing the same thing that you can do with a rotary dial. Now, neither one of these phones actually fundamentally changed how we do conversation, but they did lead to a technology that eventually changed things, and that was touch tone IVR. This was introduced in the mid-70s, and y'all know what I mean by that, right? For checking, press 1, savings 2, credit cards 3. This was another remarkably sticky technology, and it is still in wide use today. So, 50 odd years down the line, we are still using it. Now, touchtone IVR is not in itself a conversational technology, but it is a stepping stone that gets us there. Touchtone IVRs were pure command and control. To do X, take this action. To do Y, take this other action. But the interesting thing about touchtone is that it did have effects. Touchtone IVR is that it had effects on what it meant to use a telephone to do a conversation. Now, sometimes when you placed a call, it wasn't a human on the line who answered, it was a machine. Okay? That's a big deal in terms of the context for conversation. So back to telephones. Starting around 25 years ago, there were two new kinds of phones that really started making changes to the way things had been up until then. Mobile phones and landline phones that have a similar form factor. It is actually the ergonomics here that made the big difference. Why does it matter? Why does the form factor of this phone matter? Basically, they're still just phones. It's because to use a touch-tone IVR, you have to press the keys. When you've got a handset that you have to hold to your head and then pull away to press buttons, all of a sudden, DTMF IVRs don't seem like such a great technology anymore. And so what happened next? It opened a gap for a new technology to come in. Now, this is not a technology that was born of DTMF. This was a longstanding technology with its own history. And by the way, remind me during the Q&A, and I will give you an excellent reference that is much more rigorous than the history I'm giving you about all of this history. What happened post touchtone IVR? Well, the ergonomics of those phone handsets ushered in widely available speech technologies. Specifically, I want to direct our attention to a kind of technology called directed dialogue IVR. Okay, this is the technology in which you present the user with a set of speakable commands. So rather than for checking, press 1, for savings, press 2, you can say checking, savings, loans, etc. At its heart, directed dialogue interfaces were still command and control, just like DTMF. But in an interesting way, they kind of masqueraded as a conversation. And that's exactly how they were sold. Just say what you want. No more need to press buttons. But of course, it only works as long as you say one of those predefined magic words. Okay? Now, speech technology did enable use cases that really weren't practical with DTMF, but it really didn't supplant DTMF altogether. So for example, it is much easier to say Washington than to hunt on the phone keypad for the numeric equivalents of each letter of the word Washington. Okay? And this is the point in history when conversation design as a profession is born. This is maybe a nice time to stop and remind ourselves that the technology, no matter whether we're talking about touch tone IVRs or LLMs, the technology itself is not the problem, and it's also not the solution. So if these new speech-enabled directed dialogue IVRs were any better than the DTMF equivalent, it's not because of the speech technology itself. It's because there was now a set of professionals who were applying user-centered design principles to the creation of these user interfaces. This was back when we were all calling ourselves voice user interface designers, or VUI designers. I'm not going to spend too much more time on this, but one thing I do want to say before I move on to the next phase in these technologies is that the main thing that I think we need to protect as we go forward in the era of large language models and generative AI is having a dedicated set of professionals whose sole focus is the experience that we are delivering to end users. I'm going to be on this slide for a minute, and I apologize in advance. This is a super interesting one. The "How may I help you" era is a really weird one. What I'm talking about here is interactions where you call an organization and they say, "Welcome to Acme. How can I help you?" And for most users, you're left like a deer in the headlights going, what do you mean? What do I say? This again was powered by a slightly different technology that eventually led us to the neighborhood of large language models. These were statistical language models. And the idea was you can just say what you want in your own words. Okay. Of course, it was only one layer deep. And after you said what you wanted in your own words and we got to the point of fulfilling, you had to go back into your command and control language. The big problem with "How may I help you" type interactions is not that, users can say so many things and they can say them in so many ways. That's not the big problem. That's what people talk about. But the big problem is that users don't change their behavior just because your application invites them to. Why? Well, they've just spent the last X number of years in this command and control world. So once they get to your "How may I help you," it's a negative transfer of training. Things that used to work, behaviors that used to work for me no longer do. Plus, other applications, command and control ones, use words like "How can I help you?" but they don't have the tech to back it up. And even for applications that do have the technology to back it up, many of them can't deliver. So this is the first big mistake that conversation designers as a profession made. We played along with this marketing hype. We were pantomiming UX activities, but we weren't addressing some of the underlying fallacies in the interaction model. Okay? The way we talk with a piece of technology is not like we talk to humans. This is especially true when we're asking people to talk one way to an initial, how can I help you prompt, and then go back to command and control later. Okay? And in many ways, I would say that the contradictions inherent here and the willingness of designers to buy into this fallacy, it created the opportunities for LLMs in the contact center. So now we're finally at the point in history, we're in the early 2010s. Siri was huge because it was the first technology that made the general public willing to engage with speech technology. Much of early Siri behavior was a parlor trick, but it did change user behavior in that interesting way. Now, following on that success, there was the age of voice assistants like Amazon Alexa, which, by the way, was going to be the IVR killer, except it sort of turned out to just be a more convenient way to set timers and play music and ask about the weather when you were busy doing the dishes. It's a classic eyes busy, hands busy rationale for voice. And then along came ChatGPT, which is maybe the everything killer. It's maybe especially the conversation design killer. So let's spend 1 minute talking about the traditional purview of conversation design. The work product of conversation design was and still is in many cases a set of lovingly hand-scripted bot responses and a corresponding set of flow diagrams that show all the possible paths through the application. So the big challenge pre-LLM used to be constraining the things that users would say to things that we expect so that we can keep them on those predefined paths and away from the conversational death spiral that you get whenever a user actually takes us up on the dare and speaks truly conversationally. Now, I'm going to do a true confession here on behalf of my profession. Which I think actually a lot of my colleagues might argue with me on. I believe that much of accepted conversation design practice was patterns that were designed not to serve the people using the technology, but to deal with flaws in the underlying tech itself. This was the second nail in the coffin of conversation design. We were for much of our history in the business of coddling the tech, not serving humans. Now listen, there have always been conversation designers who took a much more expansive role of the work that we did, and they undertook activities that all of you in the broader UX community would recognize as real human-centered design. But to be honest, that was not the norm. And this is, I would say, the third nail in the coffin of conversation design. We conversation designers did not succeed in changing the culture in the contact center to be a human experience first culture in the way that the UX community largely did succeed. I know you guys can argue with me on that. It's not perfect, but having been married for the last quarter century to somebody who works in the broader UX community, things are better there than they are for us in conversation. So, everything is changing now. We have generative AI that can produce convincing, fluent responses, so nobody needs to lovingly hand script them. And there's really no need to be reliant on these complex flow diagrams. All of this can be accomplished today through prompt engineering, a set of instructions that we can give to the bot. So, if you believe, like most people do, that the role of conversation design is to produce a set of bot responses and a set of flows, and given that LLMs can generate fluent bot responses and they don't need those flows, then conversation design, as most people define it, is indeed dead. I think it is futile for conversation designers to argue with people about this. The much more productive thing for us to do is to focus on helping organizations understand what is needed to make really good use of conversational AI. The first lesson that I think we can teach people is that fluency itself is not sufficient. Okay? LLMs do indeed produce responses that are often labeled human-like or natural. I think the better term is actually fluent. They fit in the conversation. They are highly adaptive to the last thing that the human said to them. So in some ways, LLMs are indeed competent conversationalists. And this is very different from previous generations of supposedly conversational technology. Listen, guys, LLMs have already passed the Turing test, and AI voices routinely fool humans, making us think that they're not talking to a bot, they're talking to another human being. But if you think about the jobs that organizations are giving to AI agents today, simple fluency is not enough. What do we need instead? What we need are three things: a set of well-structured standard operating procedures. This is highly analytical work. What are the tasks to be accomplished? Where, and what is the data that supports those tasks? When is it appropriate to bail out to a human agent? AI agents also need a code of conduct. This puts boundaries around how we, as an organization, interact with our human customers. And in addition to making that kind of definition, you also need the ability to identify when bot responses fail to comply to that code of conduct, and the ability to adjust the instructions, to adjust the prompt engineering to correct the problems. The last thing that you need is one of the only ones that I hear LLM companies talking about. Situational awareness means just, knowing what's going on around you. And LLM companies in particular are stuck on the idea of the context of the conversation. That is vital, of course. Conversation does not occur in simple question-answer pairs, question-answer pairs. No, conversations are built so that you can jump up to an earlier point. You can refer to things you've talked about before. The more important kind of awareness that an AI bot needs to have is knowledge of the user's relationship with your organization, and knowledge of other ongoing interactions that this user is having in other channels. Okay? What is that kind of awareness bias? It allows us to avoid tons of effort trying to disambiguate an utterance like, hey, can I get the status on my transfer? In a financial services context, transfers can mean any of about 30 different things depending on your organization. If you just know who this user is and you know what transactions it's got ongoing with your organization, you can skip all of that intent disambiguation work, and you can just sort of say, oh, this guy's talking about a transfer of ownership. Here's what's going on. Okay? And by understanding what is going on in another channel, and here I'm very much thinking about a web chat interface, it allows users to ask very conversational questions like, can this be part of the appliance bundle? What's this? What does this mean? How do we figure out this? If you have an awareness of where the user is on the web page and you see that it's garbage disposals and those aren't part of appliance bundles, well, then you can answer that question. So I want to wrap up with two last things. Who could it possibly be to take on these tasks? Who's going to be great at the highly analytical work, at the evaluative work of understanding, is the way the bot's talking in conformance with our code of conduct? And what is the context that we need to make this AI bot aware of? The right people to do that work are UX strategists, and I'm going to float a new term here, UX analysts. Okay? I think that a lot of us who have been conversation designers over the years can more properly find ourselves in this analytical role where instead of focusing on the presentation layer of the interactions, we can do the preparatory work of understanding and documenting in a lovely way that'll work great in prompt engineering, those standard operating procedures and a code of conduct. And you can then evaluate how the bot's doing after the fact. The last thing that I want to leave you with is a quote, and this is actually the title of a paper from my friend Seth Early. He wrote a paper. It's almost a decade old at this point, and the title is exactly what you see there. The role of data and the structure and quality of your data structures is taken on an order of magnitude more importance in the age of AI. It is vital. You don't get good behavior out of AI unless you've got your data in order. And I'll wrap it up there. I think maybe we have time for one question.
Yep, I think we have time for one, and there's one that's been upvoted. James Lewis asks, how compelling are current conversational AI at achieving the goals of dialogue management, especially detection of conversational markers that indicate a change of topic?
Oh, Jim, thank you for that very, very hard question. I think that there has been some progress in detecting the sort of change of topic thing, where I see current LLMs still falling down on the job is in knowing when to jump back to the previous topic or when to say, let's persist and talk about this other change of topic instead. So I think that in some ways the dialogue management is better than I've ever seen it before with other tech, but I think there's still a long way to go.
All right, so we are at time. Thank you so much, Dr. Susan Hura. Please give Dr. Susan Hura a big applause in the emotes. Thanks again.